Welcome to the first Nex Gen podcast series produced by the LIDC, Ligue internationale du droit de la concurrence, International League of Competition Law. Throughout a series of 7 episodes, our expert guests will explore the intersection of competition law with emerging technologies like cloud computing and artificial intelligence, and will delve into the legal, economic, and policy challenges these innovations pose to competition regulation worldwide. All the views expressed throughout this podcast are the speaker's own and do not represent the views of the LIDC nor any of the companies and organizations with whom the speakers may be affiliated or the clients they represent.
So it's a pleasure to welcome you to this 4th podcast in our series on competition in cloud and AI. Last time round in the previous podcast, we were discussing competition issues in the cloud. It was a discussion that has really led very naturally onto this one, where we're going to focus more on the detail of the EU Data Act and its provisions. We're going to think about equivalence and functional equivalence, and then we're going to consider why analogies between cloud and open banking in particular, but also telecoms to some extent, may be inappropriate. And then we're going to think about some of the unintended consequences of the EU Data Act. So if I can set us off a little bit, the EU Data Act is a very interesting, I think, legal text because it is very broad in nature. It covers, so it's a horizontal and symmetric regulation, so it's drawing in here a much wider group of firms than, for example, the Digital Markets Act, which is of course specifically focused on a small subset of gatekeeping firms. Not only is it interesting because it's horizontal and symmetric, but it's also interesting because cloud has been, I guess, kind of shoehorned to an extent to my reading of the text in there. We have a text that reads very clearly about Internet of Things and related service providers, setting out obligations for data access, data sharing, and then cloud crops up. And so at the outset, one thing in my mind is, well, okay, we had the DMA before, and no cloud service provider has been designated. I think technically it's very difficult in order to actually do that. And one wonders whether or not this push in the Data Act to include some kind of cloud regulation is perhaps a response to a realization that cloud can't necessarily be captured, or at least not without some real interpretative magic going on, captured by the DMA. So we're going to focus on 2 concepts that are really at the core of the cloud provisions in the EU Data Act. And the first is something that was raised in the previous podcast, which is the notion of equivalence. So there is this idea in the Data Act that there exist, and I'll quote, a set of data processing services that share the same primary objective, data processing service model, and main functionalities. And that once we've identified that set of firms, we can do some regulatory work on them. Now, Sean and I have a paper which I recommended as essential reading, abusing my chair position in the previous podcast, and I'll flag it up again because actually this really needs unpacking a little bit. We find that actually at best this notion of equivalence is effectively just a very broad initial filter that might capture roughly similar services, but that in reality any given functionality that may be notionally equivalent, let's say, is likely to be implemented quite differently by different providers. And that's not to be a surprise. That really demonstrates how assiduously they compete and how clearly they know what their customers need, the demands of their customers. So they will implement roughly notionally similar functionalities in different ways. Now, the second concept that's key to the Data Act is functional equivalence, and it translates into a requirement. And it's worth reading from the legal text, because functional equivalence involves re-establishing, on the basis of the customer's exportable data and digital assets, a minimum level of functionality in the environment of a new data processing service of the same service type after the switching process, where the destination data processing service delivers a materially comparable outcome in response to the same input for shared features supplied to the customer under the contract. In short, that basically means that if I am the supplier, the original supplier of a service, if my customer wants to now switch to another provider, I have a fairly enormous burden on my shoulders, which may involve releasing or making available confidential information, information that may be protected by trade secrets law, potentially revealing or sharing IP assets, in order to enable the destination service provider to provide the same thing, to provide the same functionalities. And while that is only something that is mandated at the infrastructure as a service level, something really key to note here, and I'm sure Shruti, you'll come in on this, which is that actually the way in which the layers of the cloud are kind of neatly compartmentalized only works in a textbook. This isn't actually how it works. And that in particular, the lines between infrastructure as a service and platform of a service are increasingly blurred. So these are two concepts, and functional equivalence is a requirement that's been introduced in the Data Act, which we think, Sean and I in our paper, raises real concern. And I think that if I maybe hand over to Sean, he can run through some of our analysis.
Thank you very much, Ben. Maybe I should start out by saying I can understand why legislators and policymakers might have been worried about some of the aspects of these markets and wanted to do something about it. So the starting point I can well understand. And then the question is whether there's something whether it's legitimate, and then whether there's something that can really effectively be done that would be useful. And those are hard questions to answer. I think that in this instance, based on some things I've heard, there may have been a lot of legislative thinking that was based on analogy to other industries, and especially to the telecom industry and to the banking industry. So if you look back prior to this regulation or legislation coming into place, the UK had instituted open banking several years before, and this is perhaps one of the inspirations or originating thoughts for what the legislation will be trying to replicate here. Now, I think there is a difference in scale between cloud operations and open banking. First, it's worth noting that the open banking rules actually took a long time to implement properly. A lot of discussions between the banks and the overseer of those rules. But fundamentally, there's a big difference in cloud, which is that the number of features that many businesses will care about is much larger than for a typical current account. Mm-hmm. And second, the variation in terms of the offering between providers is much larger than the variation between banks. So these two things mean that actually there's a much more complicated job of creating some type of open banking analogy that works within cloud services. and it's because of these more features, more variation is a deeply different type of situation. And so I think if we're starting with this analogy with open banking, it's just worth. I'm not making this up. If you look at patenting behavior, for example, you will find that around 2010, 2013, there were relatively similar number of patents being registered that used the words current account or banking and cloud computing, relatively similar number. But after, and the number stayed relatively constant for banking subsequent to 2013, but after that, the number of patents with cloud computing in the description shot up. It increased by 10 times. That's showing there's really a lot of innovation here. And that's why there's variation in the product features.
Absolutely.
It's and that innovation is it's perhaps patents aren't a perfect indicator of innovation, but I think this is very telling for saying there's a major difference between cloud computing and banking, and comparably, portability of telephone numbers. That's a different level of complexity from portability of data services over the cloud, right?
For me, as well as from the data perspective, like when it comes to open banking, you have 25 designated data sets that can be. They don't say all data from the whole bank needs to be able to switch and move. So, and the same with like a telephone number, that's like 5 data points. Whereas in cloud, you're talking millions of data points that need to be moved. But the thing that I think you said earlier when you were like, well, what is the actual impact? What is the behavior that we're trying to change here? And I do question, and I'm not sure about open banking because I haven't looked in the UK for those statistics, but I do know open banking in Australia has not led to an significant increase in switching. And that is my question. If that's the behavior that we're trying to encourage, will it encourage switching? Like, even if we did this? And that's where I struggle with this regulation is, are we causing, so many potential problems? And are we okay with those problems because what the end result is everyone's going to switch and we'll have lots more switching? Yeah. I'm not sure whether we will.
And maybe one way to imagine this is we are in early days in terms of legislative regulatory environment for this area of activity. It's a bit like telecom in 1900. It's really there's a lot of refinement to come. Yeah. Maybe this is a first step, but I bet there will be more steps later, and some of those further steps will probably take account of some of the things we're talking about today.
Yeah, and Shruti raised a very interesting point earlier on in this podcast series, which is essentially around market-based solutions. So Shruti, I recall you mentioned that cooperatives had formed between certain cloud providers. And I think that what we can imagine also being a very viable alternative to, top-down mandated interoperability provisions is that firms, and we're already seeing the nascent kind of stages of this, of firms coming together and using interoperability in the market as a competitive parameter. And so why not, at least from a legislative perspective, see if that genuinely comes off, see if that genuinely provides an alternative. And of course, the maturity, as Sean says, the maturity of firms is a huge factor at play, as well as the maturity of the technology. And in the previous podcast, we discussed, the reality that a lot of firms are on the way in at the present moment, not necessarily considering switching. So timeliness of this is a big question.
Yeah. And I mean, just to add to the point Lauren raised, is the legislation even, we really need to ask if the legislation's really going to achieve the objective it set out to achieve, which is have customers switch a lot more. And maybe they may not, because as Ben said in an earlier segment of this podcast, maybe there is no desire to switch either. So, that needs to play in as well. But the problem with all of these analogies, like Sean mentioned, is that in addition to not potentially meeting the objective that you've set out to achieve, it may lead to some unintended consequences. I think in this example, and I think this is what Sean is alluding to, and Ben, if you're sort of mandating the requirement to have functional equivalence, you then are effectively stifling innovation and leading to commoditization of cloud services. So, whereas today you have competitors, even smaller ones, often competing on the basis of, say, greater security that they offer or greater speed that they offer. And in fact, those features allow them to compete against perhaps bigger players in the market or other more competitive players in the market. Commoditization will mean that ultimately competition is reduced to price competition. And, that's really the only choice that customers will have remaining. Is that really the outcome that Europe wants to achieve? I think that's something that needs to be thought about very carefully. The other sort of point to keep in mind is operational challenges. It's all well and good to say we should have interoperability, we should have data, very easy data portability. But I think there's a greater understanding required of the technology required to achieve that. It's not, while regulators might think that things happen at the click of a button, it's often not that simple. It takes a lot of time to develop that sort of technology. Sean mentioned in an earlier episode about, Apple delaying the release of Apple Intelligence in Europe. And I can't speak for them, but that probably one of the reasons related to that was, the technology needs time to be built, in order to make sure that it complies with new legislation. So that's another point to keep in mind. And I think the third and final point I'd sort of say that could be an unintended consequence of this sort of regulation is data security risks, right? Because with the more you transfer data across different providers, the more potential there is for leaks of that data or cybersecurity attacks on that sort of data.
Yeah.
So,
and the more similar features get, the more hackers know about those features
how to hack
and what's going on.
Yeah, exactly. So I think it's very very important to keep those sort of potential unintended consequences in mind. And the lesson here for other legislators, authorities around the world to keep in mind based on the EU Data Act is really, in my view, make sure to consult stakeholders and understand the technologies involved before imposing regulation. The Europe did do that, but I think there was a bit of a rush to get the act in place, and they could have taken a bit more time to actually consult with all the stakeholders and understand their views and understand where legislation would in fact be helpful in achieving the objective, which is giving customers choice. And I would say useful choice or choice that would actually or innovative choice as opposed to simply choice based on price.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I would definitely say from my perspective, if they helped companies like us out that help people manage their data better and incentivized companies to actually understand their data and manage it well, that's where choice gets. So my clients that understand data and truly understand the value, they can pick and choose cloud providers because they know what ones are going to provide them value for what.
Yes.
Whereas in the ones that just have huge data lakes and have no idea what's going on, they're the ones that have to go with a big cloud provider because it's cheap and they don't know what to do with it otherwise.
Yeah. It's I think it's really interesting that to kind of wrap up and conclude this section that not only are we potentially looking at regulatory interventions that don't necessarily account for the product at stake, but really that don't account for the variance and sophistication of the user of that product. And there is, I think, as Shruti has said, and it's something that Sean and I discuss in our paper very much, which is that there is a real risk of a race to the bottom here. Competition purely on price is not unrealistic as an end game if you pursue too heavily this kind of an approach. And this is actually something. So in the previous podcast, we discussed empirical research that's been undertaken for Ofcom and the CMA. And the CMA has a piece of primary research that is really fascinating to read, because in this primary research, which is empirical, qualitative research, talking to the users of cloud services, it is indeed raised by some service users, cloud service users, that a lowest common denominator approach or outcome could realistically be the outcome of this approach, that they are capable of accounting for, as we've discussed before, really this trade-off between complexity, variation in features, and ability to easily switch. And so before we move on to consider other areas, I guess that, as Shruti's rightly said, the lesson very much, or the takeaway from this may be, for other jurisdictions to watch and learn, and certainly in our so Sean and I have responded to the CMA's consultation in this area, and the CMA, I think, is an organisation that has here an opportunity to perhaps very, very carefully watch what is happening in response to regulatory change in the European environment.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Nex Gen podcast by LIDC. To stay up to date with future episodes, we invite you to visit the LIDC website and subscribe to this channel. We look forward to having you with us again.